For years, this product sat in hospital wards, given to patients who couldn't chew, couldn't swallow, couldn't eat on their own. Doctors trusted it. Nurses administered it every day. Families associated it with exactly one thing: someone they loved was too sick to eat normally. That history should have been an advantage. Instead, it became the biggest barrier to selling it outside a hospital. A few years later, that same product was sitting on a shelf next to protein powder, bought by tired, healthy men in their 40s who had no idea where it came from. The product barely changed. What had to change was something much harder to move, what people believed they were looking at when they saw it. This is the story of how that happened. The protein supplement category, a few years ago, was moving faster than almost anyone inside a large, established company could react to. New brands were appearing almost overnight and taking meaningful market share. Many had none of the company's decades of experience in clinical nutrition. Internally, teams felt several of these formulations fell short of nutritional standards the company would have insisted on for its own products. Whether the market agreed was another matter. Those products were selling, and selling fast. Sitting inside one of the largest health and nutrition companies in the world, marketing had no equivalent product to compete in that boom. Not because the company lacked the science. It had spent decades building expertise in nutrition. It simply didn't have this specific product, in this specific format, ready to launch. The obvious answer was to ask R&D to build one. The obvious answer also came with a timeline, the better part of 2 years, in a category where new brands were gaining momentum in months. 2 years was not a plan. It was closer to conceding the category before competing in it. That was the problem sitting in the room when this story begins. The meeting where this started wasn't about protein supplements at all. It was a category review. Marketing and R&D leadership working through the company's portfolio alongside what was actually happening in the market, trying to understand why the pipeline had fallen so far behind. When the discussion reached protein, the mood in the room was closer to frustration than strategy. Marketing had already asked R&D for a competing product. The answer had come back. The better part of 2 years before anything could realistically launch. In a category growing that quickly, 2 years wasn't simply a delay. It meant watching someone else define the market first. Then someone in the room said something that changed the direction of the conversation. What if the company already had the answer? Not in development. Not waiting on approval. Already sitting on a shelf. The product being referred to wasn't a protein supplement at all. It was the company's long-established clinical nutrition formula, used for decades in hospitals for patients who couldn't eat normally. The room didn't treat this as settled. 2 separate questions came up, and they weren't the same question. The first was scientific. Was this genuinely a strong enough product, or were they just trying to make an existing product fit a market it was never designed for? The team went back to the formulation itself. Compared against what was already dominating the category, it held up. Real protein, balanced macros, something the company could stand behind on the science alone. That answered the first question. The second wasn't scientific. It was the harder one. Did the company genuinely have the right to win here? Or was this just a convenient shortcut wearing the language of one? That debate took longer, and it wasn't resolved by another spec sheet. It was resolved by looking at the category itself. Most of what was winning right now was, by the room's own standards, mediocre. Against that bar, this wasn't a shortcut. It was a better answer that happened to already exist. That settled both questions. The room had its answer. Now it had to convince everyone else. The company had prepared heavily for the resistance it expected. Legal reviewed the claims. Finance backed a 2-year supply commitment. And across the healthcare community, key opinion leaders were brought into the conversation, not to sell them the product directly, but to hear their read on the category and, in that same conversation, their view on the company's own existing formula. The opinions that came back were genuinely their own. Physicians of that standing don't rubber stamp a brief. But the room had already decided weeks earlier that this product was the answer. The outreach wasn't being used to make that decision. It was being used to build independent validation around a decision that had already been made. From there came a coordinated medical push, national CME programs, medical conferences, so that by the time a consumer encountered the product, a doctor's endorsement was already attached to it, not chasing behind it. That solved the problem the room expected to have. It wasn't the problem that showed up first. The pushback, when it came, wasn't from doctors. It came from consumers and the people around them. Reports started coming back of people questioning why someone was using it, A colleague noticing, a spouse asking, a friend recognizing it from a hospital stay, a relative who'd once needed a feeding tube. Nobody was confused about what the product was. That was exactly the problem. They already knew, and what they knew carried the wrong association. The company had solved for credibility. What it hadn't solved for was meaning. Fixing that didn't mean hiding where the product came from. The hospital use was real, and enough people had a first-hand memory of it that trying to distance the product from that history would only have made it feel evasive. So the campaign did something closer to the opposite. It told people, in effect, that if something is trusted enough to give a patient recovering from surgery, its hospital pedigree isn't a weakness. It can be read as a signal of quality. And it cost less than a comparable whey protein. The product hadn't changed. The hospital connection hadn't changed. What changed was the inference people were being asked to draw from it. Hospital use had meant this is for sick people. Now the same fact was being used to suggest this is held to a higher standard than the alternatives around it. The doctor relationships built earlier turned out to matter here too, though not quite in the way they'd originally been built for. Once physicians were comfortable discussing the product publicly, some of that comfort reached consumers secondhand. Through a pharmacy conversation, a doctor mentioning it in passing, simple word of mouth. It wasn't the mass endorsement the company had originally planned for. It was one more thread reinforcing the same reframe. From what I remember, it took roughly 3 to 4 months before consumer sentiment genuinely started to shift. The larger commercial change took much longer, closer to a year and a half. The product never changed. The claims never changed. What moved was the inference people were being asked to draw from the same set of facts. And changing that inference took something the room hadn't planned for. Not a better product, not another claim, but enough time for the same truth to acquire a different meaning. There's a useful distinction underneath this story. A fact and the meaning attached to it aren't the same thing, and a company doesn't always need to erase the first to change the second. The product's decades in hospitals were never in question. That history couldn't be undone. So rather than trying to erase the association, the company gave consumers another way to interpret it. Not simply this is for someone who is sick, but this is trusted enough to be used in clinical settings. But that only works when the new interpretation is genuinely supported by what is already true. Reframing doesn't make the underlying facts infinitely flexible. That's worth watching for elsewhere. A heritage brand trying to look modern, a technology finding a market it wasn't originally built for, or an unglamorous origin being turned into provenance. When you see that happen, look at what actually changed. Did the underlying fact change, or did the meaning attached to it? 6 cases in this room now. A children's product, a men's supplement, a doctor's prescription, a meeting room pivot, a device built for the wrong customer. And this time, a formula that never changed, sitting inside a story about what people believed had changed. Different products, different rooms, the same discovery, every time. Somewhere inside the system, a decision gets made long before the customer ever sees the result. The next time something is being sold differently than you expected, ask what actually changed. The fact, or the meaning attached to it. This is the Influence Room. See you in the next case.